much. I say I'm delighted to be here and to be talking about Bishop Kenneth Cragg, who, although I had met and I had interviewed, I didn't really know him that personally, and I only really met him in the latter part of his life. Although I would like to think I saw him when I was a toddler, 5 or 6 years old. Cragg would have been in the country at that time. He was born in Blackpool. He may well have gone back to stay with his parents that summer when my parents took me to Blackpool, and they were the beach preachers. And my mother thought this was appalling, that they were interrupting people's holidays. They should be ashamed of themselves. But my father took a different line, and he thought that these people were very brave to be open air preaching on a beach in Blackpool to a load of mill workers and coal mine workers, things like that. And I remember him saying, you know, I want you to sit there and to listen to these people because they're very brave, they've got some backbone. Cragg did do preaching work, but whether or not he was there on that occasion, I don't know, and I don't know who I was listening to, but I keep it as a fond memory. Well, I was going to do a bit of a straw poll, but first of all, has anyone never heard of Kenneth Cragg? Good.
There was one online.
Yes. Has anyone read anything by Kenneth Cragg?
I imagine most people.
Yes, go ahead. And anyone here who personally knew him? Yourself?
Well,
yes,
Joy,
one or two people.
But
yes.
and us. Yes, I've met
yes,
him.
yes. But for those who didn't really know Kenneth Cragg or have hardly heard of him, I'll say a little bit about his life. Kenneth Cragg lived a long time. He was just a few months off being 100 when he died. His mind was still active to the very end, and his last book, Bent to Literary Event, had its book launch on Tuesday, the 11th of August, 2011, at the College of St. Barnabas, which was a home for Church of England clergy. And Cragg at that time was 98. At the reception, Len Harrow, who had, the editor who published, I think, nearly the last 15 books which Cragg had written, whispered in my ear, "This may not be his last book." He has another in the pipeline. But sadly, Bent to Literary Event was to be his last published book. And the book in the pipeline remains unfinished and unpublished, although Len Harrow was kind enough to give me a copy of the draft chapters. Well, Cragg's not only he lived a long time, but as I've intimated, he was working right up to the very end. Although in his last year or so he was very frail and in a wheelchair, he was taking part in the weekly discussions. And he did speak on several occasions on Christian-Muslim relations. But his published work is enormous. 70 or more published books. And he has published literally hundreds of essays, articles, book reviews, etc., let alone all of the, not only just lectures, but sermons which he would have written. Although talking with Len Harrow, Len thinks that some of his sermons may have ended up as the basis for some of his articles. And like a lot of authors, he never threw anything away, but would use them again for if he thought they had some life left in them. I've been studying Kenneth Cragg since about 2006, when I heard of an MA at Haythrop College in London. It's a college run by Jesuits on interfaith dialogue. It changed its name from interreligious dialogue to interfaith dialogue, and dialogue slightly changed as well. But I think we all understood roughly what that was about. And I specialized in Christian-Muslim relations. And I was encouraged by my tutor, some of you may know him, Anthony Omani, to read and write one or two things, one of my essays on Kenneth Cragg, and I wrote my dissertation on Cragg's work, if I can remember it. Can we reimagine an Islam with a purely Meccan identity, as set out in the writings of Bishop Kenneth Cragg? The Quran is divided into the Meccan surahs, which were received by Muhammad later into the Medina surahs when he had left Mecca and had gone to Medina. The tone of the two surahs is very different. I won't go into that now because this is not what I really want to talk about, but that was my dissertation, which, to my great surprise, I got a very, very good mark. I mean, I did not consider myself to be an academic, and I was encouraged to go on and do a PhD, which I did on the work of Kenneth Cragg. Initially, it wasn't going to be the subject of the book. It was going to be on relationships, human rights, and responsibilities. Because I think we quite very often, and Cragg refers to this, are very keen on our rights, but we're not so good on our responsibilities. And certainly the two creation stories, one in the Bible and the one in the Quran, are slightly different as to the responsibilities which we have. But in the first year in researching that, I came across a lot of stuff to do with mysticism. And someone said, oh, Cragg would have nothing to do with mysticism. And slowly I discovered more about this side of Cragg, not just the Christian Muslim side. And I changed the title of my thesis, and I moved towards looking at this aspect of his work, which was largely ignored by most academics. Even now, I still find new articles written by him, often published in obscure journals, of which even the British Library doesn't hold a copy. However, the internet has made searching so much easier, and Cragg's vast amount of work, published over a 60-year period, makes really any attempt to assess it as a whole virtually impossible. Moreover, Cragg doesn't work to any systematized structure. Rather, like his unplanned life events, he tended, by his own admission, to drift into things. He would react to his immediate surroundings. However, his underlying tenet is any response of faith to life, any relating of life to faith must by needs be autobiographical. And that is indeed a basis of a theology of biography, which I expanded on that in my book. I don't want to expand on that in this talk, because as you can gather, there are so many facets to this really amazing man. I feel so privileged. I had the time and the ability and the resources to read and research this man's fascinating life. And Cragg says himself that, for me, this is Cragg speaking, it will always be important to seek the text of the life as well as the text of the writing. So his written work and the way in which he lived his life, you say, are intertwined. They're both as important. However, anybody who has read any of Kenneth Cragg's work will find that his style of writing is, to say the least, incredibly challenging to understand. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, who knew Cragg quite well, considered it necessary to reread a piece of Cragg 17 times. Cragg didn't go in for bullet points or sound bites. Also, it is difficult to know his intended audience. A high command of English, both language and literature, is needed, together with a sound knowledge of Christian theology and an understanding of Islam. These are the basic requirements for any approach to Cragg's work. And this may seem strange, considering that Cragg came from fairly humble working class background, but his knowledge of literature and indeed of scriptures was quite phenomenal. And he would often lecture without notes and suddenly recite pieces from the Quran in Arabic, translate. It was, well, I was just so impressed by this man. So briefly, some biographical details, which will help also to understand his writing if we follow his tenet. He was born in 1913 in Blackpool, so he lived all the way through the 20th century and into the 21st. He was born into a conservative Church of England evangelical family. His father was a shopkeeper, and so was a rung or two above the holiday makers who were from the local mill workers. So Cragg's father, it wasn't the property ladder, but the social ladder on which you would hope your child would rise. Cragg's brothers and sisters were initially placed in clerical jobs, slightly higher on the social ladder than that of a shopkeeper. Now, Cragg was fortunate to live in a period of great social change. He had a scholarship to the grammar school and then to Jesus College, Oxford. And this saved him from what he has described as the cul-de-sac of an apprenticeship to the corner chemist. But his father was going to take him out of the grammar school and get him an apprenticeship with a pharmacist. But a friend of his father's begged Cragg to remain at the grammar school, which he did. And then he went on to get the scholarship to Oxford. And if you like, then the rest is history. He was ordained after getting his BA at Jesus College, Oxford. He was ordained as a deacon and as a priest, and he was later consecrated as a bishop. He never became a bishop of a see, or even as an assistant bishop, such as I think in my own diocese, we have the Bishop of Chelmsford, who incidentally, she and her father were greatly influenced by Cragg. Her father was the bishop in Iran and had to flee Iran with his family after the Great Revolution there. And unfortunately, his son was murdered. But my bishop is a Bishop of Colchester, who is an assistant bishop to the Bishop of Chelmsford. But Cragg never seemed to have got into the framework, if you like, of the bishop in this country, because he was initially appointed as an assistant bishop to the diocese that changed its name. Sometimes there was an archbishop, sometimes there wasn't. In Jerusalem, sometimes it was in Cairo, and his job was to Arabize the see, so that the Archbishop of Canterbury no longer would have had any say in who was appointed. That was highly, initially contested. It was put on hold. Eventually, he went out there, and a lot of his work has not been recognized. And this is one of the things I would like to do, because there are some archives here of this period, and to see just the story and the work in which he put in, so that you started getting indigenous Arab becoming heads of the church, becoming bishops, and running the church for themselves. And the imperial, if you like, white Anglican clergy took a back seat, retired, or came back to England. His time in Oxford was the beginning of what he called his siftings. This was his thinking method for growing both spiritually and academically. And I've tried to look at this process because I've always been interested on this thing here, how it works, my relation with mine and other people's relationship with theirs. And Cragg seems to have used as a sieve his experiences of where he was living. And this time when he was out in Lebanon, first of all. Imagine that would be a great culture shock from Blackpool or Oxford. And for the first time, he met a lot of Muslim people. He went there without any training. He spent the first year learning Arabic. His wife-to-be, she was left behind in England and went to a missionary college in Streatham for 2 years, and she joined him just as the Second World War was breaking out in Lebanon. And I think she wasn't allowed to get married for the first year. This was the college rules in those days. But they married and went on to have children. So he would sift his theology with his experience and find that initially some of his evangelical theology, if you like, didn't quite match up with his experience with Muslims, who he realized were just as devout as he was. I think that was the first thing which really, if you like, shocked him and led him on to a new way of looking at Islam and valuing it, and valuing Muslims and valuing their religion. Just going back, he does seem to have drifted into ordination, and he doesn't really know what is going to happen. There was this expectation he would become a missionary overseas, but it was meeting his future wife, Melita, which confirmed his thoughts of evangelism. She also wanted to have a ministry, her own ministry, or mission, if you like, and the two of them, that joined them together, and he went to Lebanon. He didn't go with the Church Missionary Society. He went through a very small Bible society run by two ladies. I think Cragg was perhaps the first or possibly the second male person which they'd had in nearly 100 years. They had a number of schools, he clearly wasn't very fulfilled there, because very quickly, through the auspices of the bishop, the Anglican Church of England bishop in Jerusalem, he became attached to the university, the American University in Beirut, and he and his wife founded a hostel for the students of that university. He also became involved with some of the local churches, and I think with one of the Bible colleges. But that was interrupted by the Vichy government, and all of the English people were kicked out of Lebanon, and he and his wife went to Jerusalem for a period of time until the Vichy government was dissolved. The English government got the mandate, and Cragg became more associated with the college, the American college, particularly through a man called Charles Malik, and he got interested in philosophy. In fact, Charles Malik went off to become the first ambassador of Lebanon to the States, and then became involved with the United Nations and responsible for the Declaration of Human Rights. This is where I was going to do my thesis, you see. See how it's a very complex life, which tends to get boxed into it. You know, it's his work with Muslims, and to a certain extent, his evangelism. This chapter of his life in Lebanon, he describes as the sifting of the East. And he says that this sifting of discipleship, the testing of its metal, this theme of sifting permeates all of Cragg's writings. And any attempt at reading Cragg's biographical detail must take account of the interaction between his life and his faith and his thinking. Cragg's life was also one of prayer. As a Church of England priest, he would have said the office of matins and evensong, and he would have sought out or formed daily prayer groups to further his daily cycle of prayer. Cragg writes, the academic would, no doubt, have been easier without the sacramental, the ecclesial dimension without the studious, but they both had to coexist. You know, Pickbat is saying that the academic world would have probably fared better without priests poking their nose into it, or that the ecclesial world would have not have had the scholarship without there being priests who have, like Cragg, and made a study. He said they had to coexist together. So it is this, to me, the spiritual side of him, which is seldom given credit. Now, the turmoil around the formation of the State of Israel, which Cragg has quite a lot to speak about, that again doesn't really come into this lecture. But that meant that in 1947, Cragg and his family had to leave for England, and he returned to Oxford. And he wrote his thesis for his PhD entitled Islam in the 20th Century, the Relevance of Christian Theology and the Relation of the Christian Mission to its Problems. So it really is a very strange work. You fortunately do have a copy, 2 volumes. Whether they were typed on the same typewriter which he had for all of his life, I don't know. But I'd never really studied the typeface. I might do this one day. But I've read it. The copy which the Bodleian Library have is slightly different from your copy, in that at the back of I think the first volume, he's stuck in 2 pamphlets which he wrote on the incarnation and another pamphlet which escapes my mind. I think when he was asked why was it so long, and he said, well, they didn't tell me when to stop. So in this thesis, we can see what Cragg describes as faith's maturing and amending. He does admit to that his faith did change. I think I commented that the deep roots didn't change, but various aspects of his faith changed. He moved from being a conservative evangelical to being, in some cases, a more liberal evangelical. And certainly his attitude towards Muslims was very, very different from a lot of his fellow evangelical missionaries. In fact, going back to the bishop, the Church of England bishop in Iran, he states in a chapter of a faith shrift which was given to Cragg on his 90th birthday, saying that it was Cragg's talking with Cragg and Cragg's work which moved him from a missionary aspect towards Muslims to one of working in dialogue with them. So this side of him again, of how he influenced so many people, isn't brought out. We tend to just to think of him as the academic producing endless books and papers. But a lot of people were touched by him, and a lot of people changed their birth outlook as a result of working with Cragg. So Cragg's initial encounter with Islam didn't make that much of a dent in his imperialism with which he grew up. It's only slowly did he realize that the British Empire, as it unraveled, some of the colonies gained independence, that the relationship of the Church of England with these areas changed as well. I haven't got time to go into when he was warden of the training college, St. Augustine's in Canterbury. But again, that was another time where meeting people who had come from the former colonies, who were coming for training and then going back, indigenous people, again, that made him do some more sifting. And I think where he began to shed the cloak of his imperial past. Perhaps I'm being a bit unkind to him, but I think we must remember that he was a person of his time. He wrote in his thesis, within Islam today, there is an intellectual and social crisis of great significance. He felt that Christianity has had a more prolonged experience of similar intellectual and social obligations and can serve contemporary Islam in its problems. When I first read that in his thesis, I thought, that's a little high-handed, you know. Well, we know we've got, you know, we know the answer to your problems. We've been through them. We can help you to. I think that initially was rather naive, and he did again change that outlook. Although he changed from having a mission to Muslims to having a mission to Islam. And I think he learned to become humble, that he developed what's known as embassy, that you go and live with these people, you like an embassy, you would learn as much as you could about them, and you treated them as equal, that we were not the super people, you know, the master race, as it were, taking out Christianity, which you should all change. And, well, I'm sure you know some of the horrors of early missionary work. Sorry, I've lost my place here. Right. So there doesn't seem to be any doubt in Craig's mind that this is what Islam wants. Although he doesn't seem to have interrogated Islam on this particular point. So this uncharacteristic, if you like, approach of Cragg was tempered in 1951 with an appointment on a 5-year contract, which, as Cragg said, came out of the blue, to the Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, USA. And he became editor of the Muslim World Quarterly Journal and a professor in the Department of Arabic Studies. And here he honed up his editing and literary skills and published in 1956 his first book, the seminal The Call of the Minaret. And this is the revised version. It went into several print runs, I think 2 editions. He revised it greatly in the last edition, and I understand it is still in print. And it is still sometimes cited in book lists on, you know, for Christian study. So, but he sets out this revised thinking of attitude towards Muslims, one of being slightly more humble, one of accepting their faith, accepting the fact that they were very devout, accepting Muhammad as their prophet, and that was very, very unusual at that time. So in this book, Cragg sets out an authentically Christian relation to the mosque and to the world. And the book invites the reader not merely to an exposition, but to an adventure. In an article written in 1967, 10 years after the book, Cragg openly challenged in a fundamental way the attitude of Christianity to other religions that had so dominated Protestant thinking during the previous decades. And he notes that the West in general has failed to relate itself to the rest of the world in anything like the full range of spiritual obligation or even external loyalty to its own deepest resources of the soul. And it is from this base that Cragg engages with Islam, engages with Islam through teaching posts, Christian Muslim conferences around the world, writing and publishing. As I've just mentioned, he ceases to have a mission to Muslims, but rather a mission to Islam. He made a lot of long plane journeys, which is very unusual at that time. traveling around Africa, India, the Middle East, so much so that the Kenneth Cragg Travelling Fund was set up by, I think, the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. And that fund is still there today, helping to fund missionaries with their traveling expenses. But I have to tell you this. I'm digressing quite a lot. I hope you don't mind. But in one of the parish churches which Cragg worked in when he was retired, there are these embroidery panels on the wall. And Cragg would embroider these as he sat waiting for his plane to take off. I mean, it's just, sorry, I had to tell you that. A plethora of posts took him to Jerusalem, Canterbury, Cambridge, both in this country and in the States, and Cairo, with shorter periods in Nigeria, back in the States in New York, and then forays into India, Pakistan, and Persia. And his vision was that by speaking to each other, both Christians and Muslims might be led more deeply into their own faith, as well as having a better understanding of each other. Now, the main problem I had in researching Cragg's engagement with mysticism, particularly that of Islam, is that apart from one book, The Wisdom of the Sufis, published in 1976, he has written little that deals exclusively with this subject. Very recently, in the last week or two, I was speaking with Len Harrow about this book. He doesn't reckon very much on it. It's a very slim volume. And he says he thinks that it was at the time of an exposition of Islam. It was held in London, a festival, and he was probably lent on by the publisher to produce something on Islam. But it's a very, very strange little book. I may refer to it in a bit later on, but I haven't realized I've waffled on for such a long time. I shall bring it to an end very soon. Thank you. I thought I was low on material. I'm sorry. Right, I shall speed up. But what Cragg has composed is scattered throughout his books and articles, making it difficult to trace his own understanding of Sufism, which led to his appreciation of this book, which he calls The Wisdom of the Sufis. And for the first time that Cragg writes on the subject of Sufism was way back in his doctoral thesis, and where he presents Sufism in a very positive light. He says, this is in his thesis, the tendency has been to discredit Sufism as superstitious and heterodox. So I had slipped in some extra bits of work there, but I won't deal with them. But yet it remains a fact that it represents some of the most religiously vigorous parts of Islam. Cragg's thesis goes on to endorse Sufism as it represents some of the most religiously vigorous parts of Islam and provides a moral compass for Muslim political and religious leaders. Whilst initially this may seem as being somewhat pragmatic, there is at this early stage in Cragg's career little comment by him on the mystical side of Sufism. His deeper appreciation of Sufism, its theology and spirituality had yet to evolve. In 2004, Cragg published a translation which was called A Theology of Unity, And in his introduction, he was, I think, a co-translator in this book. He actually shows a little bit of disdain at the excesses of Sufi mystical asceticism, but he doesn't really elaborate on this. He finds this esotericism distasteful at any level. This comes out a lot in reading between the lines, and it's something which I really need to push a little bit further, because I think to try to understand his theology, if you like, we need to understand his relationship with his metaphysics. And metaphysics is a very, very strange area. There seems to be a lot written in Islam about metaphysics with a lot of technical terms. I was listening, I think, some lectures given by one of the other groups in Oxford. And I thought, oh, if I am going to be looking at this side, I may have to really start to look at some Arabic, but I don't know. I mean, I've got a limited amount of time left in my hourglass. So racing on them, Cragg tried to show commonalities between Islam and Christianity. And this brought him criticism between both Christians and Muslims. And I did have a bit of a criticism from Akbar, but yes, Jabir Akhtar. We were talking about this man who was associated with this area as well. He was in the Faculty of Theology and Religions at the University of Oxford, and a visiting senior research scholar at the Centre for Muslim Christian Studies in Oxford, and has long been one of Cragg's most vociferous critics. In his article, An Islamic Model of Revelation, he notes that certainly the Islamic tradition, taking its cue from the Quran, has seen Muhammad as no more than a mouthpiece, if a sentient and intelligent one. Cragg sees this model of revelation mechanistic in its terminology, as at once both puzzling and unnecessary, and suggests that, this is Cragg, suggesting that Muhammad, this is Akhtar commenting on Cragg, suggesting that Muhammad may have received the revelations as a result of a Sufi-like practice of contemplation, which allows for the possibility of a rational explanation of the origins of the Quran other than the purely miraculous. Akbar hammers Cragg on a number of occasions for Cragg's treatment of this tradition of the revelation of the Quran. It's one of the areas which he brings up in many, many of his books. But I haven't seen a comment on this mystical side of where he tries to show that Muhammad, if you like, and again, I'm putting words into Cragg's mouth, was an early Sufi. Anyway, we must press on. So although Cragg has been criticized by Muslims and some Christians, seeing his engagement with Islam as a surreptitious sort of proselytism, Cragg and Muslims who criticize Cragg do acknowledge this, that Cragg respected Muslims, but he also wanted to encourage them to value their own religious heritage. Now, Cragg really didn't like the term mysticism, but used it mainly referring to Sufism. Spirituality was for Cragg his pathway to understanding and a deepening of his relationship with God. And that is, God as revealed through the incarnation. While he saw Sufism as a foil to the strictures of Sunni dogmatism and as an ethical basis for those in power, he similarly used Dag Hammarskjöld as an exemplar of Christian mysticism. I've said he had no time for esoteric practices, and he implicitly doubted the value of those mystics who sought union with God through esoteric practices designed to bring about an altered state of consciousness. The classic one would be the whirling dervishes. They're spinning round, they would achieve a different state of consciousness, which will enable them to go into a mystical unity with God. However, by studying Cragg's approach to Christian spirituality and Muslim mysticism, I gained a deeper insight into Cragg's mind and thought. So I think that's where I will end this. As you know, I've only just touched briefly on many things. I felt it was good to put some of this stuff into context of Cragg's developing life, how going to the Middle East, how his attitude to Muslims changed. I am still not sure really whether he does really approve of mysticism, or whether it is parts of mysticism, or mysticism as he defines it, which is what he approves of. And that is something which I'm still researching. And as I say, I would like to bring in this metaphysical side of his thinking into this this further work of mine. So I think on that I will draw it to a line.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David.